In September 1832, and when cholera already haunted every street, one act of depravity unleashed a terror unlike anything Manchester had ever seen. A child, just 3 years old, John Brogan, the son of an Irish labourer residing at number 88 Silk Street, he was carried to the Swan Street Cholera Hospital. Now, the boy was already in the last agonising throes of the disease, his tiny body racked with spasms, his skin drained of colour. Sadly, 4 hours later, he was dead, and Manchester would quickly find out. Saturday the 1st of September. John Hayes, grandfather of John Brogan, arrived at the hospital and asked to see the body of his grandson. Now, whilst distraught to see the lifeless body of the young boy, he took some comfort from the kindness and sincerity offered to him by all of the medical staff on duty. It was at number 88 Silk Street in which John Brogan, he lived there with his grandfather John Hayes. We don't know anything about his own parents, however. We know John Hayes himself looked after young John Brogan. And they lived, like I said, at number 88. Now, 88 Silk Street has long since vanished. But where we are stood now, we believe, was where 88 once stood. And I'll turn you guys round. And it would have been around about here. I do have to point out, however, that there are 2 Silk Streets here in Manchester. The one we're currently at is in the Ancoats area of Manchester, just off Oldham Road. The other Silk Street is still along Oldham Road, but further in that direction. But we believe it is this location where 88 once stood, and like I said, where John Brogan used to live with his grandfather, John Hayes. Later that afternoon, the body of John Brogan was taken to what was then known as the death house, basically a temporary morgue. Cholera victims back in 1832, their bodies, well, they had to be quickly interred, simply because obviously the disease they were carrying. They tried to contain the infections as best they could. Now, when a coffin arrived, it was found to be too small to contain the body of John Brogan, so another one had to be sent for. This would obviously postpone the funeral arrangements for John Brogan, because like I said, his body was supposed to have been interred that same day, that Saturday afternoon. However, it was the Sunday morning at 8:30 when John's body would be finally taken to what was then called the new burial ground. It was also known as Walker's Croft, but as you will soon see, things have changed dramatically. When morning came, the coffin was found to have been sealed down. No attendants had placed the child inside. Instead, it was suspected that Robert Oldham, a newly appointed dispenser of medicines at the hospital, had interfered with the corpse. And what was shortly discovered would shock the city to its very core. But something began to gnaw away at John Hayes. And as the hearse containing not just John Brogan's coffin, but many other coffins, as it arrived at the new burial ground, and it was when they were being removed from the cart itself, he noticed that all, or most of, the coffins had nameplates, and these nameplates, they had names written on in chalk. One of them, however, and which was John Brogan's, didn't. There was no nameplate, there was no name. And John Hayes' gut feeling was telling him something wasn't quite right. He demanded that the coffin be removed from all the others and that the lid be removed. Now at first, obviously, the authorities, they refused. They kicked up a stink saying, no, it's disrespectful, leave it as it is. You know, your grandson is in this coffin, we're going to continue with interment. But Hayes himself wouldn't accept this. He just had this gut feeling that something wasn't right. He then began to claw away at the wooden coffin, the lid. And he would really struggle to open it. But eventually, the Reverend who was helping with the interments, he backed down and he began to help John Hayes remove this coffin lid. What they found inside was truly horrific. The child's body was headless, severed clean at the shoulders, and in its place, in a mocking, obscene kind of way, somebody had placed a brick. The coffin was closed again and interred into the ground, but whispers soon spread throughout the city. Throughout the day, these whispers just grew and grew to an extent that several hundred people had congregated at the burial ground waiting for the next delivery, if that's the right phrase, of coffins. It was around 4:30 that afternoon when the next hearse arrived. And at the gates to the burial ground, like I said, there were many people waiting. It was reported up to 200 to 300 people in total. They'd made their way to this burial ground because they wanted confirmation, they wanted proof that what they'd been hearing in the city centre was indeed true. John Brogan's coffin was lifted from the ground, with John Hayes himself removing the lid, bearing the mutilated remains to the mob. Indignation turned swiftly to rage. "Burkers," they screamed. The name spat like poison. And just as Burke and Eyre had murdered for profit in Edinburgh, so too they believed the doctors here had also turned to murder. Another scream was heard coming from the crowd. "Burn the hospital." The mob took the coffin away from John Hayes, lifted it high above the shoulders and began making their way towards the Swan Street Cholera Hospital. With the child's headless body paraded before them, the mob swelled, 3,000 strong, roaring down the streets of Manchester. Through Miller Street, Swan Street and New Cross they marched. The coffin was thrust high, the child's body exhibited to all. Some spat oaths, others fell to their knees in horror. But the mob grew with every turn until finally they returned back to Swan Street itself. At the hospital, the gates themselves were torn open, and once inside, fury was unleashed. Windows smashed to shards, furniture hurled out into the street, beds and chairs splintered into kindling, and as the cry for fire spread, a hospital van was dragged into the open, smashed apart and set ablaze atop a pile of bedding. Flames quickly devoured it, licking the night sky as the mob howled for vengeance. From the newspaper articles, it appears that many of the doctors and obviously any of the medical profession, they'd quickly realised that things were turning extremely ugly, and they fled for their lives. And again, it was written that it was most probable that their blood itself would have been spilled onto the cobblestones that very day if they stayed behind. So where that riot took place would have been here, just on the corner of Swan Street, and this is where the former Cholera Hospital once was, and it is here where the body of John Brogan was obviously badly mutilated back in 1832. He was brought here by his grandfather John Hayes to seek help. Instead, he died here, and obviously his head was removed by an unscrupulous, well, not even a doctor, it was a dispenser by all accounts. Now, as the evening went on, Reverend Hearn himself, he came out and he begged for order. He begged for all these rioters, this angry mob, to disperse and go back to their homes, but they didn't take any notice. This angry mob split and a second wave of rioting began. As the mob carried the child's coffin, a terrible transformation took place. What had begun as grief and righteous anger soon turned into something far more grotesque. Now here, just outside, or very close to Victoria Station, this is where most, if not all, of the cholera victims will be buried. From what I gather, a lot of these victims of cholera, they were buried in lead-lined coffins. Again, this was to stop any further outbreaks of the cholera disease. But it was a place known as Walker's Croft, or the new burial ground. But it was here where John Brogan himself was originally brought to. So it was here where the riots themselves, one could argue, originated, and it was here, as I've just said, where John Brogan's body was brought to, obviously minus his head. It was here where the rioters took hold of that coffin and made their way through the streets, parading it like it was some form of attraction. As the mob carried the child's coffin, a terrible transformation took place. What had begun as grief and righteous anger soon turned into something far more grotesque. Now, amongst these mob of rioters were a few opportunists. They were making money off the event, off this tragic incident. They were stopping carriages and passers-by, opening the coffin lid, showing this grotesque image of this young boy minus his head. But they were charging people in doing so. They were demanding money off these people just to view this body. So this horrific incident had turned from one of deep sympathy and anger towards the medical profession to one of opportunists, like I said, people making money off the back of this horrific event. The body of this child, paraded through Manchester like some carnival attraction, became a grotesque spectacle. Every scream, every sob, every shudder of horror was fuel for profit. And in this way, the mob's grief was twisted into theatre, its outrage was turned into commerce. It was no longer a riot, it was a marketplace of misery. Now again, as the evening wore on into the later hours and things weren't de-escalating, maybe one or two people finally had enough and went back to the homes, but this rioting, this mob, it was just continuing going through the streets. The 15th Hussars were eventually called for, and they were based at the nearby Home Barracks. Now, these Hussars were also the same cavalry establishment that were involved in the Peterloo massacre that took place also here in Manchester. Another story for another day. But they were soon called for, and they quickly made their way here to Swan Street and the surrounding areas. Now, it was the sight of this cavalry, these light mounted cavalry, these soldiers, it frightened quite a lot of these rioters off. And many of them fled into the night. They didn't want to get involved with this army, these blade-wielding soldiers. So many of them dispersed. So what happened when it comes to Robert Oldham and the man responsible for this act of depravity and this desecration on the body of John Brogan? Well, from all accounts, there was a board of health that held emergency meetings, and they swore that they would hunt down Robert Oldham. However, that was easier said than done. And it appears that Oldham himself just disappeared. He vanished off the face of the earth. As soon as this rioting began and he realised he was in trouble, serious trouble, he just simply fled. Nobody knows where he went, nobody knows if he had accomplices, nobody knows anything about Robert Oldham. All people know is he was responsible for the decapitation of John Brogan. We can only speculate as to why that was. Perhaps he was doing it for medical reasons, for just a macabre interest in the human form, the human body, or perhaps there was something a little bit darker involved. Perhaps he was doing it simply to sell the head, which was later found in somebody else's house, just for pure profit. But either way, Oldham simply vanished into the night. He was never seen or heard from ever again. At 5:30 in the evening on Tuesday the 4th of September, the body of John Brogan was laid to rest once more, this time in St Patrick's burial ground, sealed inside a lead coffin to prevent any infections. Now just behind me is St Patrick's Church, but just like a lot of the original features in today's story, it has changed so much. We're on some wasteland just at the back of that church itself. From what we gather, there are no headstones. There is nothing to suggest that there are any bodies buried beneath our very feet or set further back and towards the church itself. We do know that John Brogan most definitely was interred within the grounds of St Patrick's back in 1832. We have a scanned document which clearly shows this was the case. What makes that document more disturbing is what was handwritten on the top right-hand corner, and it details John Brogan being mutilated by a Mr. R. Oldham. Without these scanned documents, without the painstaking effort by volunteers and paid employees, stories such as today would certainly, or almost certainly, have been forgotten. But these historical documents that have preserved so much history, they are a godsend, and they do keep these victims' memories very much alive. So we know 100% that somewhere close to me is the body, or was the body, of John Brogan. And his body was placed into a lead coffin, and that was to prevent, as I've touched upon, any further infections. I don't think we're going to find anything, however, here to show where John himself is interred, because like I said, there is nothing to actually show. It was Reverend Hearn who was in charge of the interment of John Brogan, and as many people stood over the coffin, he asked them all to step back, to take a step back and to accept the truth. Now eventually the crowds would subside, people would go back to their homes, but they would be still very much angry at what had occurred over the past few days, from the rioting, but more importantly, to the desecration of this young boy. Now, some of the mob, upon their arrests, they would face trial. Some were fined, some had to pay sureties, some were even let off because there was a lack of proof that they were indeed involved. Now, to understand what occurred that Manchester day, that riot, why was it so ferocious in nature? And why did the riot really begin in the first place? In the 1830s, hospitals were not sanctuaries of healing, they were houses of death. And once a cholera victim crossed those doors, they rarely returned alive. Families whispered that the hospitals were nothing more than waiting rooms for the grave. And there were darker fears still. Only a few years earlier, the Beck and Hare murders in Edinburgh had horrified the nation. Men who killed to sell fresh corpses for dissection. That scandal never left the public mind. To the poor of Manchester, it seemed all too easy to believe that doctors, hungry for bodies, might be doing the same. Rumours spread like pestilence itself, and to many people, they believed that the water itself had been purposefully poisoned. Others claimed doctors and officials were deliberately spreading disease simply to cull the poor. And for Irish Catholic families, the suspicion cut even deeper. Many believed their children were treated with less care, or worse, experimented upon in secret. So obviously, to many people, upon seeing obviously the body of John Brogan, minus his head, this was just confirmation that all their fears, all their worries were true. They believed, or a lot of people believed, that experiments and obviously the illegal dissection of bodies of human beings was indeed happening. The proof was in the pudding. Poor John Brogan, minus his head, was simply confirmation. The cholera epidemic had already left the people weary, broken, fearful of death. Yet nothing could ever have prepared them to witness the sight of a child's coffin being paraded through the streets. the body being headless and a brick lodge where innocence once was. A city sickened by plague had glimpsed something darker still, human wickedness unbound.